Hey everybody, we're back in the shop today, and today I'm working on a project that's a commission for somebody who wants a stainless steel hunting knife that has a good amount of bling on the handle. We're going to have some file work, going to have a really nice polished ironwood handle, some spacers in there. It's got all the good stuff. Anyway, we're going to start with these drawings. I have two different tracings of my drawing that I worked with the client to design, and I'm going to paste one of these onto the steel and cut it out. Let's get cracking. As with many of my knives, I designed this one first on paper, and then I made a tracing of my drawing. Two tracings actually, one of the entire knife and one of just the blade and tang. I'm gluing this second tracing directly to the piece of steel that I intend to use for the knife. And then I trace with a razor blade around the entire perimeter to make sure that it's also scribed onto the surface of the steel in case the paper comes off sometime during the sawing. This type of knife making, where you cut the shape of the blade out of a piece of steel and then grind it to shape, is called stock removal knife making. When I first started making knives, I had already spent a couple of years learning blacksmithing, and I thought that every knife ought to be forged with a hammer on the anvil. And that stock removal seemed kind of like cheating in some way, like it wasn't a true knife. But at this point in my career, after more than a decade of making knives professionally, I've come to see that stock removal certainly has its place. Because both forging and stock removal can make an excellent high-performance knife, I choose whichever technique is going to be the most efficient in terms of my use of time and materials. Anyway, now that the blade has been cut out and ground to shape, I'm coating it in a green stop-off paint, or anti-scale compound that will keep the blade from scaling or losing its carbon to the atmosphere inside the kiln. After soaking the blade at 1950 degrees for about 20 minutes, it's time to quench the blade. For Nitro V steel, I quench it in oil first, which cools it rapidly down from that initial temperature. And then once it's been in the oil for a little bit, but before it's all the way cool, I bring it over to my quench plates. These are just steel plates in my vise, and I clamp the blade tightly to keep it from warping as it cools all the way down to room temperature. As the blade cools, I prepare to do the liquid nitrogen treatment. When the blade cools rapidly from 1950 degrees Fahrenheit all the way to room temperature, the crystalline structure within the steel changes, which makes it hard. But certain steels with higher alloy compositions, like this Nitro V, take lower temperatures to fully transform, and that's why I dip it in the liquid nitrogen. So basically, the cold treatment makes the blade slightly harder so that it'll hold its edge just a little bit better. And after the cold treatment, I put it back in the oven at 350 degrees to temper it and make sure it's not too brittle. But watching a knife in the oven is rather boring, so I left it out of the video. After heat treating, I scribe a center line on the edge of the blade, which helps me to keep the blade symmetrical as I grind it to shape. I start by grinding the flat sides of the blade with a 36 grit belt, which helped me to get rid of any minor surface imperfections. I want both sides to be flat and parallel before I go to grind the bevels. I start the bevel grinding at a steep angle, grinding the edge down to thickness first. Once the edge thickness is mostly established, then I gradually decrease the angle of the blade to the belt sander in order to bring the grind line closer to the spine. I'm working carefully, always watching what I'm doing, and I quench in water between each pass to make sure that the blade doesn't overheat. I do the vast majority of my grinding with a 36 grit belt, which leaves a coarse finish, but it removes material very quickly. Then I switch to a 120 grit belt, followed by a 220 and then a 400 grit belt to polish and remove the scratches from each previous grit. The last thing I do in the grinder is polish the spine and the choil, which is the underside of the blade. I polish all these areas at 400 grit, and then I also round the corners to make it more comfortable in the hand. I'm planning to fit a steel finger guard onto this knife, and in order to make that transition between blade and guard as smooth as it can possibly be, I carefully prepare the shoulders, which are the transition between the blade and the tang. This carbide grinding guide makes it much easier for me to grind both of those shoulders exactly in line with one another, so that they'll fit tightly on the front of the guard. Once I'm satisfied with the shoulders on the blade, then I can remove the guide, and the grinding is complete. The final finish on this blade will be achieved by hand sanding, but before I hand sand, I like to etch my logo into the blade. I designed this logo a number of years ago, and it's a stylized version of my initials, J and L. I had vinyl stencils of this logo made so that I can repeatedly mark it on each of the blades that I make. I tape the stencil to the blade to make sure that it doesn't move around as I'm etching. Then I affix a cloth pad to the head of my electro-etching machine, and I saturate it with an electrolyte solution. I attach a grounding clamp to the blade, and then the machine will run a DC current through the electrolyte solution, which will allow it to etch rapidly into the metal, only where the stencil allows it to. To keep the oxides that form during etching from clogging the stencil or the pad, I find it best to clean the mark occasionally as I go. It's also a good opportunity to check and see if I can catch my fingernail on the mark, which is usually a good depth test. It typically takes me between 3 and 5 minutes to get a good deep mark. If it's sufficient, then I'll switch the machine from DC to AC mode, or from etch to mark, which deposits a thick, durable layer of black oxide in the bottom of the mark, making it contrast well with the surrounding steel. Then I can peel off the stencil and neutralize the blade. Looks clean enough. Now it's time to hand sand it. If I've done a good job grinding the blade, I can usually start hand sanding at 600 grit, which saves me some time. I'll finish this blade out with an 800 grit satin finish, but for now I'm just going to go to 600 grit. I remove all the grinder scratches with a back and forth motion, and once they're completely gone, then I do long pulls from one side of the blade to the other, trying to keep all the sanding scratches parallel and continuous. A hand-rubbed satin finish like this one is one of the most technically challenging and time-consuming finishes to put on a knife, but it really does look nice once it's all completed. Okay, so I've got this hunter blade all finished up, and now it's time to assemble all the handle pieces. So we're going to start with the guard, and we start from front to back, obviously, because it has to slide on this direction. So I have this piece of 416 stainless steel, and we're going to slot it out on the mill and get that fitted so that there's no gap between the ricasso and the guard. So because I have a milling machine, I don't really need to mark where center is, but I do need to mark where the ends of the tang are going to be. So I'm going to make a little bit of a mark there and there. Hopefully I'll be able to see those when I go in the mill. You know, because I have these shoulders on the guard here, there's a little bit of leeway, so the slot can be a little bit longer than the tang is wide, and you won't see it because it'll be hidden under the shoulders there. So that's kind of the secret about guard fitting. I can even just use a Sharpie, and that'll get me close enough. Okay, well, that didn't work quite as well as I hoped. The tricky thing about this particular guard is that I've used three 30-second stock. It's a little bit oversized, so we're right around 1/10 of an inch thick. And a 3/32 inch end mill, which is my smallest end mill, is right around a 0.09. So 90 thousandths versus 100 thousandths of an inch thick. And so that's not very much wiggle room to remove material on both sides. And when that bit goes into the hole, it wobbles around a little bit. And so it actually makes a wider slot than the end mill itself, which means that there's a gap. One possibility is I could really just hammer the front of this guard, just kind of mush the gap together and then sand off the top of it. And so that's maybe what I'll do. Ideally, I would have a mill with a Z-axis, which means that it can move up and down, and that would allow me to drill the holes first with a drill bit that's undersized, and then mill the slot to shape, and that would take away a lot of that kind of slop in the mill. But I don't really have that option right now, so I could try to do it again and just be a little bit more careful and more precise, but I don't know that it's actually going to work. So what I'm going to do is exactly what I mentioned, and just kind of squeeze this thing together with a hammer, grind it back to shape, and make sure that I can get it fitting tightly on the guard with no wiggle. Hear that rattle? It's the sound of a bad fitting guard. And here's the fit, just so you can see what I mean. You see that big old gap there? You can see light through it. That's not what we like. That's not good at all. So let's just take that to the anvil and hammer it shut. All right, so it closed up more in the back than it did on the front, but it still looks pretty good. I might pinch that front just a tiny bit more, but then I should be able to just kind of file it out to shape. As you can probably imagine, hammering on the guard distorts the surfaces quite a bit, so it's important to flatten the front and back again on the disc sander before proceeding to the next step. So I'm using a drill bit that is just ever so slightly undersized. You notice the drill bit fits down here, but it doesn't quite fit up here. So that means that the slot is tapered. It's not exactly parallel, and so it means I need to file a little bit more on the top side. All right, so now that slot's even. Let's check the knife. All right, so we still need to get a little bit bigger here. So now I've got it this close, I'll drive it on just the last little bit with a hammer. That'll make a nice tight fit. All right, that's a nice tight fit. I'll take that. So I got the handle block that I'm going to use here. Desert Ironwood Burl. Really pretty stuff. It's way thicker than I need it to be for this knife. I mean, that just an inch thick is a little bit too much, I think. It just makes a really bulky handle. So I'm going to take off just a slab, basically, on the side of this knife to kind of slim it down. And then we can get to laying out the handle. This design calls for a number of spacers, one of which is made from the same burl as the handle, and I use a pair of dividers to transfer that dimension from drawing to block. And then I saw out the piece that I need for the spacer. I'm always careful to flatten the mating surfaces between the handle components to make sure they fit tightly with no gaps. Then it's time to lay out and mill a slot in the spacer so that it fits tightly around the tang. Because my milling bit's not long enough to cut all the way through the spacer, I have to flip it around and cut from both sides. Once the milling is complete, I take the spacer over to the vise and file it slightly to make the taper of the slot match the taper of the tang as closely as possible. So referencing my drawing here, this little piece here is going to be a stack of stainless steel spacers, which I've got right here. So they're going to be two thin ones around a thick one, and that thick one will get some file work. So that's roughly how it'll be. So I got to make slots so that they all fit right onto the tang. There. Alrighty, now that I have this whole pack of spacers all fit up, it's really important to label each piece. I've done it before where you haven't labeled each piece, and it's really easy to get them flipped around or turned or backwards. So here I'm taking a little carbide burr in my Fordham flex shaft, and I'm writing a little number in the upper right-hand corner of each of those spacers. So I know the number is always in the top right as I assemble the knife. And each number corresponds with the spacer's position from front to back. All right, now before I put it back together, I want to put alignment pins in this knife. Because there's so many pieces, and because they're going to have file work on them and they need to be finished separately, I need to be able to take apart and put together this knife as many times as I want and make sure that the pieces go exactly in the same place every time. And while I've done a pretty good job, fitting these spacers so that there's not too much wiggle, there is a little tiny bit of wiggle back and forth. And anytime there's a little bit of wiggle, it means that the pieces won't always meet exactly the same way every time. So the way that we do that, simple trick, is to put some dowel pins inside the knife. They're completely hidden. You don't see them when the knife is put together. So we want them in the middle and not too close to the tang, because you don't want them interfering with the tang hole, but also not too far out, because you don't want to grind into one of these holes. So those two little holes should do the trick. Ah, the dulcet tones of a rapidly dulling drill bit. Luckily, I have a gazillion drill bits, so just swap them out. It's always better to use a sharp drill bit than it is to push your dull one too far and break it in the piece, because that's really no fun. All right, sharp drills, here we go. So this part's a little time consuming, but still worth it. We put 3, 4, we've already drilled 4. 5 goes on here. Boom. But we're gonna actually super glue number 5 to number 4. It's probably more glue than I needed. And then 5 goes on. So now 4 and 5 glued together, and I'll just use these holes to line up my drill bit to drill through the next one. All right, now we glue this stack to 3. Boom.
All right, the stack is growing. We just need this one last piece. Now you want to be careful. In this last one, you only want to go a little bit into the guard, otherwise you'll have holes in the front of the guard, and that's no good. I'm going to draw a little mark to tell me how deep to drill. Okay, so now time to fit the last portion of the handle, the rest of the handle. And it looks pretty good, but I'm seeing that if I just mock this up here, I don't have a lot of wiggle room down at the bottom. I want to angle the block down just a hair, so we'll do that. Measure the middle at the front and back, and then just connect those lines with a ruler.
It's always good to start a hole with a center drill, but it's especially important on an angled surface like this. So I always do a little pick with a center drill and then switch out to the regular drill bit. Then I open up the slot for the tang using a modified reciprocating saw blade. Once the tang slides easily into the block, then I transfer the alignment pin holes from the spacers to the handle block. Now all the components fit tightly together, so at this point I like to grind the shape of the handle so I know exactly where to put the pin.
All right, let me show you a cool little trick. So I'm about ready to shape the handle on the knife, and I know that in the final design, I want this middle spacer to be a little bit oversized compared to the rest of the handle. That slightly domed spacer is going to help throw light a little bit more boldly. It's going to be a little more eye-catching, and it's also going to have a kind of cool tactile feel. It's all fine and dandy, right, in design, but then when you go to shape a handle, it's really easy if you can just shape everything together, right? So it's hard to shape with a little dome in it and have everything connect. So what I do is I make a dummy spacer out of just a throwaway material, and I'll swap these two pieces out. So this spacer will be the same as the other one, and I'll shape the knife with the dummy spacer in it, and then we'll swap out and put the other spacer in and shape it independently.
And if that explanation didn't quite cut it for you, keep watching and I'll show you the whole process.
Okay, so the profile is now roughed in, but mainly what I did is made these two faces exactly parallel, as close as I possibly could. The reason I do that is so that I can drill the pinhole, and I'll make sure it goes straight through. You don't want to drill that pinhole at an angle because your block is wonky, because then the pin doesn't end up in the same place on both sides. Symmetry is important. So before we drill the pinhole, one thing that is really important is that I have to soften the tang of the knife.
I always like to drill through the wood block first by itself before putting it onto the tang. That way if something goes wrong when drilling through the steel, then at least I won't ruin a beautiful piece of desert ironwood burl. Once the hole through the block is drilled, then I assemble the knife and I make a little mark just with the drill bit to know where to drill through the tang. Once I've made a mark, then I can take off the block and drill the tang separately. This time with a slightly oversized hole. That way I can make sure the pin slides easily into both pieces. Any extra room around that pin will be filled with epoxy in the final assembly. Once the pinhole is drilled, then it's time to shape the handle. I always shape the back of the handle first to make sure that it's absolutely square, because this serves as a good reference when I go to shape the rest of it. And then I begin to articulate the volumes of the handle, working one dimension at a time until I slowly approach the three-dimensional form that I'm going for. I just remembered that one of my favorite features to add to hunting knives like this is a bevel at the front of the guard. I feel that the bevel helps to ease the transition between blade and handle, both aesthetically and physically, and it also makes that transition more comfortable and easier to clean. I use the knife blade as a reference to draw layout lines so that I can make the guard symmetrical and parallel with the knife. And once the guard's symmetrical, then I grind the bevels on the belt grinder. Here you can see the bevels starting to take shape. Once they're established, then I polish them on a 400 grit belt. And once I'm satisfied with the symmetry, then I can go back to shaping the handle. I already ground the side profile pretty much to finish shape, and now I'm grinding the thickness of the knife, or the profile if you look directly down from the top. At this point the handle's still rectangular in cross-section, but then I take down all the corners to make that rectangle into an octagon, so that I have a faceted handle. Grinding the handle one facet at a time helps me to keep everything symmetrical, so that when I finally blend all of those facets into a rounded handle, I know that I'm going to have more or less symmetrical shape, side to side. And once I've gotten as close as I possibly can to the final dimensions with a 60 grit belt on the flat platen, then I switch to a 220 grit belt running without a platen behind it, or as a slack belt, and I grind the handle that way. The slack belt leaves a much finer, smoother surface, and it bends around the contours of the handle, and even under the contour of the guard, as you can see here. It took me several years before I was comfortable enough to do this level of finishing right on the grinder, but it does speed up my process, keeping the amount of handwork that I do to a minimum. But of course, on complex shapes, such as this tight radius into the guard, it's still helpful to use a file, and this is one of my favorite steps of knife making. After spending so much time at the grinder, I can get to sit down at my workbench, turn off all the machines, and just listen to the sound of a file cutting the steel. Then I clean up the file marks by sanding. Once I finish up with 2500 grit, then it's back to the grinder to finish the end of the handle. Most knives by this point would be nearly complete, really just awaiting the pin. But if you'll recall, there was one spacer that's just a dummy, a stand-in, and I need to make a stainless steel spacer that will take its place. I put the new spacer back into the knife, and then I trace both of the adjacent spacers onto the faces of the spacer so that I know exactly where to grind to when I go to shape it. Now I make sure not to grind too close to the line because I want this spacer to be a little bit oversized. I don't want to make it flush with all of the others. I get it relatively close with a work rest on the grinder, and then I put it back in the knife and finish it with files by hand. First, I make sure the spacer is consistent in height all the way around the knife. And then once I'm confident of that, then I go in and chamfer the corners, and then file the entire edge into an elegant dome. When it's finished, it should look something like that. And then it's time to add some file work to that spacer. I designed this particular file work pattern at least 8 years ago on an early knife that I made, though I'm sure plenty of people have used the same file work pattern long before I did. Essentially, the pattern consists of a series of opposing half-round notches that make what looks like a series of 4-pointed stars that progress around the spacer. I start out the filing with an 1/8 inch diameter round chainsaw file. It's called a chainsaw file because it's used for sharpening chainsaws, but it also works very well for this type of file work. The small diameter helps me place those notches precisely between the layout marks that I scribed in order to keep the spacing even. Then I widen the notches with a half-round needle file, and those 4-pointed stars really start to emerge. Here's what it looks like just after filing. So the next step is going to be to polish all of those small interior surfaces. And for that, I use a Kratex wheel, which is a rubberized abrasive, and it's chucked in my Fordham Flex Shaft tool. Then I briefly polish it on the buffer, and I put it in the knife to see how it looks. Well, the blade is very nearly complete at this point. The last thing that I'm going to do before gluing is just to make sure that everything has its final finish. So now I'm going to sharpen the blade, just a rough sharpening to make sure that the edge is established. And then I'm going to go back over with sandpaper to make sure that I don't have any J-hooks or stop-start marks from rubbing back and forth. I want all smooth sanding marks that go one side to the other. And once I have all of those finishes established, then I can just glue it together. And the very last thing that I'll do on the knife is put the little domed pin in. So the edge is nearly sharp. There's a little area in here that's been sharpened already, but it still needs a little bit more sharpening at the heel and at the tip. So I'm using a 325 grit diamond stone, and that should do the trick. And it probably won't take very many strokes to get it sharp where I need to. All right, so I got this edge sharp, and I know that because of two things. One, it just kind of feels sharp. But two, if you look at the edge, you can't see any light glinting off of it. If you look straight on, it makes a dark line, and that means that it's sharp everywhere. If you see little spots of light, it usually means that that edge is dull in that spot. Nice consistent finish. And now it's time for the final glue up. I like to wrap the blade in a piece of blue shop cloth, which keeps it safe, keeps it from getting scratched while I handle it and glue it. And then I clamp the blade between two pieces of wood. I like to clamp the blade end to end when I glue the handle on, And those two pieces of wood help to keep the blade stiff, and they also give me a clamping surface so that I don't have to put the clamp directly on the tip of the knife. Then I mix up the epoxy and glue it all together piece by piece. Once the knife is together, then I can place in the pin. Here I'm using a stainless steel dowel pin, which is not going to be the final pin in the knife. I'm going to eventually replace this pin with a sterling silver domed pin. I wax that temporary pin so that hopefully I'll be able to pop it out once the epoxy cures. Essentially, the temporary pin is just to keep the epoxy from filling the hole. Then I clamp the knife together and clean off any extra epoxy with denatured alcohol. I also like to oil the handle at this stage because the oil helps keep any epoxy that might leak out from sticking to the handle or to the spacers. In this case, I'm using tung oil, which is one of my finishing oils of preference. I do love how a nice oil finish brings out the vibrant color of this desert ironwood burl.
All right, the knife is now glued. Now I just need to wait for the epoxy to cure.
Now's the moment of truth to see if the wax on the pin actually prevented it from getting glued in place. I guess I'm lucky today. A few taps of the hammer did the trick. And now it's time to set the sterling silver pin in place. I like sterling silver for this job because it's nice and soft, and so it moves easily under the hammer, and you can make a nice clean, polished dome without too much trouble. I hammer both ends of the pin until it's a little bit snug in the hole, and then I file the sides off to make them the same length. Then I actually hammer the dome in with my little pneumatic engraver handpiece. I used to do this part by hand with a hammer and punch, but using the pneumatic tool allows me to hold the blade with one hand and the tool with the other, so I can work more quickly, not to mention the rapid hits of the pneumatic tool leave a smoother finish. Once both sides are nicely domed, then I hit it on the buffer briefly to give it a nice shine. And now we're really in the home stretch. All that I need to do at this point is wipe off the blade, clean off any extra wax, and then give it one final sharpening so that it's ready for use. The Belgian blue waterstone is my go-to for the final edge that I put on my nicest hunting knives and chef knives. It's a natural mined waterstone that cuts quickly and is easy to maintain. I follow the Belgian stone with a few passes on the leather strop, and then the knife is properly complete. Thanks so much for following along with this project. If you enjoyed the video, or if you had further thoughts, please leave me a comment below and I'd love to hear from you. Otherwise, I hope you choose to tune in to another video sometime soon.